Hi, my name is Todd Leonard.
And my name is Herb Montgomery, and we're just talking.
Thanks for following us and subscribing to our channel and clicking on that bell icon so you get reminded of when our new episodes drop each week. You're doing that helps more people find out about our show.
Absolutely. We are each week talking about, excuse me, the upcoming gospel reading in the lectionary for the upcoming weekend. And we're going to be talking about that gospel reading in the context of love, justice, and inclusion. And our hope is that our conversation will be, our talking will be just talking as in justice, but we also hope that something that we say during this time together as we're going back and forth might inspire you or just spark something in you to do more than just talking.
And this week, our lectionary reading is tied to Pentecost, as it's that time of the Christian year. And we have a couple readings from the Gospel of John, John chapter 7, verses 37 to 39, and John 20, 19 to 23. And we'll probably even touch a little bit into the book of Acts as well, and that reading from Acts 2. So that's where we're at this week. And so, Herb, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So we just finished up a few weeks ago, talking about John 20. We spent a lot of time
Mm-hmm.
talking about John 20 as far as the spirit being breathed out on the apostles and them being given the ability to forgive or not forgive, to bind or to loosen. Um, Maybe we could put the link to that just talking
Mm-hmm.
in the video description this week,
Sure.
so people can go back and get that too if they'd like. But this week starts with John 7 before it gets to John 20, and John 7. Man, I can't help it. The first thing that jumps out at me, as those that have been following along the last few weeks, is this: anyone who's thirsty, um, let's not dig a well. Let's not find out, who's keeping them from getting clean drinking water. Let's promise them spiritual water
Mm.
instead. It's still that tendency, that leaning to belittle or to de-emphasize or to lessen the importance of the material, the concrete, the physical world that we live in favor of spiritualizing everything and turning it into a metaphor. And we've talked about how harmful that can be, especially it can be convenient for Christians who are privileged, whom whatever's happening in the material world is benefiting them. But when that benefit is coming at the material harm of other communities, to take everything and turn it spiritual can be hurtful and damaging too. So, do you have any thoughts on that, Todd?
I think it just reinforces why reading the Gospel of John exclusively definitely gives you a skewed view of who Jesus is and what his priorities were. It's not that this is can't be utilized in some way to teach, and we'll get into that here coming up. But um, it is such a mystical only teaching with with John, and this is an just key example, just reinforcing that again.
I like how you talk about reading the Gospel of John exclusively because I find that those who favor the book of John and only read the book of John, they are typically highly motivated to have a personal, privatized spiritual experience with Jesus or God. Um, that's not the gospel that pushes them into engaging their world around them. It's the
Mm-hmm.
gospel that focuses them inward on internal spiritual development. I think of, like, in the synoptics, Mark chapter 8, when the people were hungry, Jesus didn't offer them spiritual food. He gave them real loaves
Right.
and real fish. I think of Mark 10, when he encountered the poor, he didn't offer them spiritual wealth like the riches of his teachings and wisdom or gnosis or knowledge. he told the rich to share their wealth with the poor. That's how he solved that. And I want to again, you said the Gospel of John exclusively. I don't believe we have to choose
Right.
between the spiritual and the material. A very Jewish Jesus would have had a holistic
Hmm.
concern for people, not just their spiritual well-being, but their economic, their political, their social, the material well-being as well. And again, that gives us pause, especially those sectors of Christianity that are all about saving a person's soul, but
Hmm.
doing very little to participate in the work of bringing about justice for them in this life, in this world, in the here and now.
That's right.
But
Yeah,
it can be a
that's fair to
both
say.
and. It can be more holistic if we take all the gospels together.
It can. I mean, there really is a hand in hand relationship that can exist between being a person who is a mystical contemplative person who also is very much engaged in practical loving action, that those actually merge and align themselves quite well. It's just that often the the unto its John read by itself gets the idea that religion is a very internal experience, and your job is to help other people have internal experiences, and the external is
At
unimportant.
least secondary. Yeah, it's at least
Yeah,
secondary.
unimportant if not evil.
Ooh.
And that leads to all sorts of uh, perversions of the gospel of Jesus, and misses out on the other half of the active, practical, pragmatic world here and now Jesus that we read in the other gospels.
Yeah, and you're not making this up, Todd. I just saw today one of my friends on Facebook who's pretty fundamentalist, a biblical literalist. Um, he was saying that those who focus on that Jesus was focused on the spiritual, on the internal, just reaching hearts and minds, forget about their bodies, hearts and minds, and they went so far as to say that anyone who diverts people's attention from the spiritual to the material, to the here and now, and the actual concrete world we're living in, is demonic was the word they used. And I
Hmm.
thought, whoa, that's heavy, first of all, to
Yeah.
use that kind of language. But there's a classic example of where Christians once again are focused exclusively on the spiritual and not on the material.
And what happens from that is there becomes a very a self idolatry around your belief system, um, your creeds, your doctrines, and for Christians, a belief that you have to believe in the literal person of Jesus as the saving force uh, of of humanity. Meaning, if you don't confess and you don't believe and you don't assent to the knowledge of Jesus, that you are lost. And that is an idolatry of Jesus. That is an idolatry of a belief system, and it excludes and marginalizes so many because of that exclusivist approach to the gospel.
Nice. I
Yeah,
like
sorry
it.
about that.
That's all right. Our spiritual conversation is being interrupted by the material and the physical.
That's right. But anyway, I apologize for the interruption, but that's one of the major dangers of this type of approach. Let me switch my camera so you can see my beautiful face again.
while you're getting that sorted out, I know there are sectors of Christianity that are not like this. And again, in full transparency, um, I don't have very many mystic bones in my body. I'm not a mystic myself as far as my own spiritual journey.
Hmm.
But I think of some of the greats like Thomas Merton, who I have so much respect for, who his ability and people like Walter Wink, their ability to go out and to engage the world in a life-giving way in the face of injustice and harm being done to people whom systems had made vulnerable. Their energy to do that came from their contemplative time, their mystical personal experience. So again, that just kind of once again puts an exclamation point on the fact that if the spiritual stuff resonates with you and that's where you get life from, you don't have to say goodbye to that. You don't have to let that go.
Right.
You don't have to give that up. Just make sure it's not turning you inward and isolated, that it's motivating you to go out into the world and to engage with other people, that we're in
Mm.
relationship and in community with people, and we're actually working to make the world a better place because we're here. It's not just me being in a cave by myself up on the side of a mountain somewhere in contemplative prayer.
Right. Right. And the key to that I think, and to John's credit, is in verse 38, where you see Jesus says, if you come to me to drink, then what will happen is out of a believer's heart will flow rivers of living water. And so there is clearly, though he doesn't specify it in this passage, there is something that is supposed to move outside of ourselves to have an impact on others. That even in Jesus teaching about something of a
Even the
mystical
Gnostic
living,
Jesus has that.
there's a sense of there's something that flows out. There's something that's better, and has implications for others. It's not
Mm-hmm.
just an internal pool of water only for yourself.
Right, right, right. I appreciate that. Now, if we can just actually go build literal wells of clean water for
Right.
people, you know.
Right.
So anyway, I mean I'm beating a
But
dead horse there.
that's the pragmatic side. Absolutely. That's that's where Jesus was.
I mean, think of like, I mean, in John 4, again, we're in the Gospel of John, but in John 4, here's this woman at the well. And once again, that's another example of where Jesus said, if you'd have come and asked me, I would have given you living water. You know what I mean? It says that.
Hmm.
So, yeah,
Same thing.
same thing. So one of the ways I think we can redeem this passage is by doing exactly what the lectionary does, taking sections like Luke 7 and connecting it to passages like John 20, where in John he breathes on them the Spirit in John 20, and and then tells them, now you can forgive or not forgive, bind or loosen. And I want to recommend our discussion on that a few weeks ago, if that's a new idea for anyone who's listening. But I think we can also connect it even further to the synoptic gospels. I mean, what did the Spirit, when Jesus initially, in order to breathe out the Spirit on his disciples, he had to breathe in the Spirit. And when the Spirit was on Jesus, what did it look like?
Mm.
You know, what is it characterized by?
Yeah. It's definitely, you get those impressions by going to passages like Luke 4, and saying that he's there to proclaim release for the prisoners, and to proclaim and to bring sight to the blind, and bring good news to the poor.
Mhm.
That was what the Spirit had called him to, and that's what he was about. And so now he's giving the same Spirit that was given to him to his disciples. And so you should very easily contextually and thematically be able to draw the conclusion that there's nothing different. It's the same heart and soul message that Jesus was given.
Same spirits should be same fruit. Our
Yeah.
lives should look so. And it's amazing to me that of all the passages in the Hebrew scriptures that the author of the Gospel of Luke could have chosen to characterize, to sum up Jesus's ministry, he picked the passage from Isaiah. And again, that's from Luke 4:18 through 19. Preach the good news to the poor, the freedom for the prisoners, sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. The very first one, good news to the poor. How many years of my own Christian experience did I think I was preaching the good news or preaching the gospel? And I never mentioned the poor once. The poor wasn't
Right.
even, they weren't even on my radar.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And that's, again, that's maybe why I feel the way I do about exclusively focusing on John, because I used to do that back then. John was my favorite gospel way back then, but it
Yep.
didn't produce in me someone who was concerned for the, and don't spiritualize it, don't make it a metaphor, lean into the material, literal part of this passage. Um, an exclusive view of John didn't lead me to be concerned about poverty or about people in prison or
Hmm.
about sight for the blind. And I think that was talking about, again, prison blindness back then, rather
Mm.
than the ableist definition of blindness. But to set the oppressed free. And this year of the Lord's favor, the year of the Lord's favor was not that God had wasn't Jesus announcing that God had warm and fuzzy feelings in his heart for people, like the year of the Lord's favor. That had a literal, that was the year of Jubilee. That had a
Mm.
literal economic application. The year of the Lord's favor for his culture in Luke was the year when all debts were forgiven, all
Yep.
debts were canceled, people were liberated and set free from the indebtedness that kept them a slave. And again, there's a tendency in us to read those, to think, to spiritualize poverty and imprisonment and oppression and the Lord's and all of that. But I just want to encourage anyone who's listening out there, lean into that, materially, concretely, literally, breathing in the spirit that we find here, especially defined in Luke. It will manifest itself. You'll breathe out justice. Inhaling the
Mm.
spirit means to exhale justice. You're concerned about those who are presently being harmed in whatever system or culture you're living in.
Yeah. And I think this is so important to think this through and to think about what the implications are, that the spirit that Jesus had in his ministry was the same spirit he was giving to his followers and to us. That it was about material change, material improvement for everyone involved. If you go to the early passages of Acts after Acts chapter 2, you see the people wrestling with what does it mean to take care of one another materially. Materially, what does that look like? It was the good news about Jesus was only to bring about communities where this material care and support could then exist in different places throughout the region. There is, you don't see this proclamation of an inward spirituality. That
Mm-hmm,
seems to
mm-hmm,
come later. It comes in the Pauline and the Johannine
mm-hmm,
passages of scripture. But when you're
mm-hmm.
reading about the history of the early church, you are seeing much more, uh, seeing people, yes, celebrating the hope of the resurrection that Jesus gives them, but that resurrection meant that we could continue developing peaceable communities that cared and nurtured one another and did what the power structure was not doing. It was a completely different approach. It was about healing the sick. It was about caring for the poor, the widows and orphans. That was what you actually see Acts trying to fulfill the ancient Hebrew scriptures prophesy, where the prophets condemned societies for not caring for those marginalized people. And you see the early church actually trying to live out the call to include and take care of the marginalized. They were carrying on the spirit of Jesus. That was the outflow of the Pentecostal experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of how in the synoptic gospels, Jesus, and we try to isolate this and make this as just like an exception to the rule. This was just like a one-off, but it wasn't if you look at the context. But Jesus tells this rich person, sell all your superfluous possessions and give the proceeds
Mm,
to the poor. That was literal, so much so that, as you're saying in the book of Acts, especially Acts 2 and Acts 4, the very first thing it says in those two chapters that freshly baptized Jesus followers would do, the very first thing they would do is not consider any of their private property their own,
mm,
but sell. Those who had more would sell what they had and give it to those who had less. And Acts 4 actually even uses what would later in Europe become kind of Marxist language much later, but in Acts 4 it's each gave according to their ability,
yeah.
and they received according to their need, each according to their
Mm,
ability and each according to their need. That doesn't come first from Karl Marx. That comes first from Acts chapter 4.
right.
So, I mean, again, there is a concern in the Gospels for people's material well being, not simply, and about injustice, not simply their spiritual well being.
Yeah.
So, for me, if I want to try to apply that to today in the world that I live in, that means, well, Acts 2, I'm thinking about Acts 2 now, since this is Pentecost weekend in the lectionary. I can tell you live in LA. I can hear your traffic out there.
It's going.
Somebody just gave someone a blessing with their horn.
Yeah, and probably their finger.
But in Acts 2 and Pentecost, the thing that was broken down was the communication barrier in the story. And today we have so much division, and I don't want to wipe it all away as saying it's unnecessary, because I believe that some of that division has been rightly caused. I don't think we should just preach for everybody to get along while injustice still is harming certain communities in our society. I don't want to tell people who are being hurt, you need to be less divisive. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is in Acts 2, when the Spirit manifested itself there on Pentecost, it gave people the ability to hear one another
Mm,
in their own language. And I think
mhm,
about today, we have not just language barriers, we have cultural barriers, we have economic barriers, we have political barriers, we have social barriers, when I say social, I mean, we live in different social locations, and certain social locations are privileged. What does it mean for the spirit of Acts 2, the same spirit of John 20, the same spirit of Luke 4, this spirit to be poured out on Jesus followers today, that gives privileged people the ability to choose, to listen to hear, and understand people in different social locations other than the privileged ones when they share their experiences. It seems like that's something that we are in need of, is a pouring out of the Spirit that would enable us to hear the experiences and stories of those who go through life on this planet in a social location other than our own, whose experience is different than our own, to hear their stories and to believe them, and allow those stories to confront us to the degree that we're willing to make changes.
mm,
That would
mm.
be a cool Acts 2 for Christians today.
Yeah. Well, and again, we see in the stories that are to follow in the book of Acts, you see that exactly happening. You see the followers of Jesus in their interactions with people of different nation state groups, uh, being being led to understand who they are and embrace them for who they are. You see Philip meeting with an Ethiopian eunuch, and Philip sitting down and, yes, teaching the eunuch, But that whole interaction is Philip recognizing the inherent worth and value of the eunuch, and uh, and willing to be close to him when often it was the exact opposite would happen, is you would not want to be close to a eunuch or somebody of a different nationality. For our culture today, being next to a white person with a person of color, there's that story. There's a story of Peter with Cornelius, and all of a sudden realizing that his whole thought about it being impure to go into a non-Jewish person's house doesn't matter anymore in light of the gospel, and that he sees in this non-Jewish person somebody who is also a child of God, also filled with the Spirit of God. And so they continue to break down their prejudices, their prior belief systems, in because they specifically felt that conviction that they needed to be with people that they had been divided from in the past, that they saw very much that they were to be a uniting force in the world, and not by dominating over everybody else, but actually coming alongside and learning and being with people who are different than them too. I think it's that the stories of Acts are so profound in exhibiting the ongoing manifestation of the Spirit of Jesus working through the early church.
I remember for myself, the first time I was exposed to seeing how deeply hurtful and how mischaracterized the LGBTQ community had been by the Christian communities that I had grown up in. Just how they were demonized, and how just horrible things said about the LGBTQ community. And I remember my first exposure to the LGBTQ community in reality, for real. And I began to see that everything I had been told about, my friends who are gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender or queer questioning, or all of that, I just began to see that everything I'd been told about them in my Christian past was a lie. And they weren't like that at all. And I saw, I had kind of a Peter Acts moment where I saw the Holy Spirit in them. And I thought, oh, God's not making any distinction between us and them. And to take that further, I mean, we think about to continue the thread we've been talking about, that the same Spirit that Jesus had, he gives to us, and that Spirit's going to manifest itself in us the way that it manifested itself or expressed itself or demonstrated itself in Jesus, through Jesus, the choices Jesus made. It means if we're going to follow that Jesus and have that same Spirit, the same Jesus who loved those who were mislabeled as sinners in the Gospels, means that we're going to care about the LGBTQ community, our friends, our folks, our siblings, who are still being marginalized and pushed to the edges, both outside of and within our faith-based communities. I think about the Jesus who cared, or rejected, rather. He rejected the bigotry towards Samaritans. And I can't help but think that maybe that means today white Christians who follow Jesus should be proclaiming in solidarity that Black lives really do matter, that the Jesus of the Gospels, if we're going to have that same Spirit, then that for us, trans kids' lives matter. The same Jesus that told us to lay down our swords. What that means for us today is that the children and the value of our children in our schools is greater than the value of our freedom to own an AR-15, or women. The way that Jesus cared about and prioritized women in the Gospels. That means that we're going to care today about preserving women's bodily autonomy and their access to the health care they need. And we could go on and on and on. The Jesus that loved the stranger. What about those that are migrating past our borders, both on land and at sea? What does it mean to actually breathe in the same spirit and follow the same Jesus that we read about in the Gospels? How does that affect us politically and economically and socially in our context today? Those are the big questions that I want to wrestle with.
Yeah. No, that's very, very, very well said. And again, and that flows from the heart. That is not something that is spiritual. It is the care for and this is the criticism that people give again and again, is to say, well, those are all important things, but that's not what the gospel is about. The gospel is about believing in Jesus. And no, that is at the heart of the gospel. If believing in Jesus matters at all, it matters so that you can love like Jesus.
That's right. That's right.
If you
That's
if
right.
if your belief in Jesus is just for you to feel good about yourself and your eternal destiny, then you haven't believed in Jesus at all, because there's way too much evidence of what Jesus did, that he was about loving others. I read a passage from The Different Drum by M. Scott Peck, where he said that one of the things that Christians have done to undermine the teaching of Jesus on loving the poor, loving the outcast, bringing in the marginalized, he said, is that we turn Jesus into such a God that we made everything that he did, his caring for the poor, his feeding of the hungry, his healing of the sick, everything that he did, we made it into supernatural, miraculous things that only he could do. And what M. Scott Peck says is, he says, we have neutered the gospel because what we should have been doing was saying, no, this was a very human Jesus who was doing these things. This was a human being who was modeling to us what we too could do. And
what
this
humanity
is what
should look like.
Humanity, this is very much within the realm of what humans can accomplish when we put our minds to it. I'm in a local community here in Glendale where we have some people within our community who have chosen to take on a crusade of attacking transgender policies at our public schools, and have been coming to the meetings and been calling for termination of people within the school district office because they are protecting the rights of trans kids in our campus. And they say, these crusaders say that by protecting the rights of trans kids, they're putting their own kids at risk, which is nothing could be further from the truth.
So untrue.
But we are seeing person after person speaking at the board meeting saying, this is threatening my family's spirituality. This is threatening the faith tradition of that I was raised in, and you are threatening my kids' faith by what you're doing in these public schools, which is a clear example of a faith that is internalized and only for ourselves to feel good and only for ourselves to live by, and has no impact upon the broader community. They could care less about the trans kids and what the trans kids are going through. They just want to protect their own families, and their faith is only about their own family's protection. And you see that false Christianity, that false faith being lived out, and how it prioritizes the privileged over the marginalized.
I think you just gave a classic proof in the pudding example that whenever we have a following of Jesus that exclusively prioritizes the spiritual. What that ends up doing is never challenging our our own biases and bigotries.
Hmm.
It ends up baptizing those
Hmm.
biases and bigotries. And those bigotries now become wedded to our spirituality because we've never allowed the spirituality to invade the material and challenge our bigotry. That bigotry is left untouched and now sanctified, made holy. And now we think to protect our bigotry and our children's training in that bigotry is the same thing as standing up for our religious identity.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
very scary.
And it is a malicious twisting of who Jesus was and what he was trying to do. It's a malicious
Jesus
twisting
would be
that
the
you can end
first
up.
in line to care about a trans kid.
That's right. Yeah. Well, there's a whole movement that's going to crystallize around having people demonstrate at the school board in a week and a half, encircling the entire school board and giving it and our trans kids a big group hug and saying, "This is this is also very present in the community. There's a lot of people
Mm,
who care about trans kids, and
yeah,
my hope would be that Jesus would be part of that circle and be
yeah.
part on that side of things, and that's what my heart tells me where he would
I
be."
think of in my neck of the woods here, just outside, 4 hours outside of DC, this past Monday on the National Mall there in DC, they held a transgender prom for all the
Mm,
transgender kids in the area, and then probably even further than that. But I just saw some pictures of the event, and just a beautiful space that was created for these kids. And so
mm,
I love it. I love it.
yeah,
And I think Jesus does too.
yeah, I do.
Yeah. All right,
Anything
man.
else for us?
That's what I got this week on Pentecost. I don't have anything else. I'm sure there are brighter minds out there that may be able to pull out more gems. That's the best I can redeem it. I'm just thankful that we're not left with only spiritual water.
Yeah, yeah. Now there's the life of Jesus always moves from the heart to the to
Feet.
those to the feet. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's you see Jesus bending down and washing feet. You
That's right.
see Jesus believing in people and then stepping out into the street to fight for them. That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
Don't tell me how beautiful your relationship with Jesus is. Show me.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I love it.
Well,
All
we are
right,
looking
man.
forward to you being at our congregation this weekend, Herb, and
I am so looking forward to it too, man. 2 more days and I will be out there.
we're very happy to have you. And people can watch your three presentations at our church this Saturday. They can watch it on the Glendale City Church YouTube channel. We'll have all three of those live streamed for people to watch or to watch them later on demand. And so I hope that people take advantage of not just hearing you in this format or reading you on your eSites article, but also we'll hear you make some presentations and just kind of take us through some thoughts and get introduced through your thoughts this weekend a little bit more to your book. So we're looking forward to that.
Thanks, Todd. Tell us where we can find you.
So GlendaleCityChurch.org. Its YouTube channel is Glendale City Church. That's all you have to type into YouTube. And you can find me at toddjleonard.com.
And you can find me this weekend on all of Todd's stuff. And after that, you can find me at renewedheartministries.com.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next week.